Hello, and welcome to Sleep with History. I hope you are comfortable, relaxed, and ready to wander gently through the moments that shape the past. This channel is new, so if you enjoy these episodes, a like, comment, or subscribe will really help. Finding real human voices telling real human history is becoming harder and harder to find on YouTube. I can offer you history told calmly, accurately, and free from interruption. Each episode based on an essay that I have written myself during my time as a university student. If you'd like to support the channel, you can join me on Patreon for just £3 a month, which helps me keep these videos ad-free. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. On a cold November night in 1989, Berliners gathered at the checkpoints that had divided their city for nearly 30 years. For as long as most could remember, these crossings had been places of fear, watched by searchlights, guarded by men with rifles, knowing that any hesitation to shoot could mean death for them. Families who tried to cross without permission tempted prison or worse. But on this night, something felt different, uncertain. Word had spread that new travel rules had been announced. Restrictions might be lifted, and change could be in motion. People came cautiously at first, carrying their passports and papers. Soldiers at the gates looked confused, unsure which orders to follow. After hours of waiting, a barrier lifted. A few stepped forward and the crowd cheered. Strangers embraced, young men and women climbing onto the wall itself, chipping away at the concrete under the lights of the television cameras. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had stood as the hard edge of the Cold War. A strip of stone and wire separating two worlds. And now it was falling, not through invasion or command, but through the persistence of ordinary people who no longer accepted its presence. To those in the city, the moment felt unreal, a curtain finally lifting on their lives. To those watching from abroad, it marked something larger. The collapse of the long standoff that had divided the world since 1945. And within 2 years of this, the Soviet Union itself would no longer exist. But that night in Berlin was not the beginning of change. It was the conclusion. To understand how history reached this moment, we must return to the ruins of the Second World War, to the place where victory blurred into rivalry, and the Cold War quietly began. In May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities had been reduced to rubble, industries shattered and millions displaced. The war had consumed everything, and the impact was felt across all walks of life. And from this devastation, 2 great powers emerged. Across the Atlantic stood the United States. Untouched by invasion, it stood at the most powerful point in its history. To the east, the Soviet Union counted its victory in loss. 20 million dead, towns and farmland destroyed and families torn apart. Its triumph had come through suffering, and its leaders were determined that such devastation would never reach its borders again. Both nations saw themselves as guardians of a new world, but their visions could not have been more different. The United States championed liberal democracy and open markets, believing prosperity came from competition, choice, and individual freedom. It was a system that valued dissent as a part of progress, newspapers that could criticize governments, and elections that could change them. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, believed in communism as defined by Lenin and hardened by Stalin. It was a system built on the idea of equality through collective ownership. Factories, farms, and resources were not in private hands, but controlled by the state, which claimed to manage them in the name of the people. The Communist Party ruled with no rivals. It had promised security and stability, full employment, housing, and good education, but it demanded conformity, obedience, and sacrifice of individual ambition. To Americans, this looked like tyranny, a system that stifled freedom itself. To Soviets, capitalism looked like exploitation, a system that bred inequality. Each side not only disagreed with the other, but believed the other represented a mortal threat to the future of humanity. That clash of worldviews quickly transformed into a clash of power. With Germany defeated, the question became, who would shape the post-war world? At the post-war conferences of Yalta and Potsdam, what began as cooperation soon became a negotiation over influence. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, though deep inside of the Soviet sector, was split in the very same way. On paper, this was a temporary measure, a way to rebuild. In practice, it had laid the foundation for Europe's division and the way things would be for the years to come. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet forces moved quickly to secure control. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and then Bulgaria saw their governments reshaped. Coalition politics disappeared completely. Opponents were silenced, and loyal communists installed in all their places. Stalin spoke of security, a shield against future invasion, but the West did not see these measures as a means of defense. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave that vision a phrase that would endure. An iron curtain has descended across the continent, he said. Behind it, half of Europe looked east, and the other half looked west. Over in Washington, the policymakers concluded that containment, not confrontation, would be the only way to stop Soviet influence from spreading further. In 1947, President Harry Truman set the tone with a simple pledge. The United States would support any people resisting subjugation. This idea evolved into the Truman Doctrine, which was soon followed by the Marshall Plan, a program of aid to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. Western nations accepted the funds and recovered quickly, but those under Soviet control were forbidden to join. Economic growth had now deepened the divide that politics had already drawn. Berlin had become the testing ground for this new world. In 1948, when the Western Allies introduced a new currency to stabilize their zones, Stalin reacted with fury. The roads, railways, and canals into West Berlin were closed. 2 million people were left cut off from food, fuel, and medicine overnight. The aim was simple: to starve the city into surrender. The Western response? The air. In a vast, coordinated effort, planes flew into Berlin every few minutes, day and night. They brought coal, flour, powdered milk, anything and everything a city needed to survive. Children gathered near the runways to watch these great machines that dropped sweets and their livelihoods from the sky. The airlift lasted 11 months, and the West refused to yield. When the blockade finally ended, Stalin had been forced to back down. Berlin stood, a symbol of endurance and a city that refused to give up. The standoff confirmed what many had already sensed. Europe was divided for good. In 1949, the Western powers formed NATO, a collective defense alliance. 6 years later, the Soviet Union and its allies responded with the Warsaw Pact. This same year, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. America's monopoly on nuclear weapons was over, and with it, any illusion of safety. The world had entered an age where peace depended on fear, a balance kept not by trust, but by the certainty of destruction. By the early 1950s, the Cold War shaped every major decision in global politics. Germany remained divided. Berlin caught between two systems, each side believing it was safeguarding civilization itself. The first major confrontation came outside of Europe, in Korea in 1950, when the North, backed by Moscow and Beijing, invaded the South. The United States and its allies intervened under the banner of the United Nations. The fighting was brutal, yet inconclusive, ending in a stalemate 3 years later. The war proved that while nuclear weapons deterred direct confrontation, proxy wars would define this new era. At home, both sides turned their fears inward. In America, the search for communist sympathizers became obsession. Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations spread through government offices, universities, and film studios. In the Soviet Union, dissent still remained unthinkable. The press repeated the official slogans, and the security services watched for the smallest act of defiance. Each society, in its own way, reflected the anxieties of the age, fearful of the enemy abroad, but also of its own reflection. From the ruins of the war had risen a different kind of struggle, one with no battlefronts, fought instead through fear, persuasion, and endurance. Across the Eastern Bloc, communist government tightened their control. Political opposition disappeared. Newspapers published only what the party approved, and the secret police agencies expanded their reach. In East Germany, the Stasi became the most feared of all. A secret police force, their task was to guard loyalty. Phones were tapped, letters opened, and informants recruited from every walk of life, sometimes neighbors, sometimes friends, and sometimes even family. People learned to lower their voices in their own homes, aware that silence was the safest language. The Stasi controlled not only what people said, but what they could know. News of uprisings in Hungary or Czechoslovakia arrived distorted, delayed, or even deleted. Foreign radio was jammed, though many listened in secret, hiding small sets wherever they could. The truth became something that was dangerous to repeat. Yet fear of consequence did not erase awareness. People saw what their leaders pretended not to see. Shop shelves were often bare. The West streets glowed brighter at night. The future that they had been promised seemingly never arrived. The gap between propaganda and experience widened each year. The authorities could control speech, but they could not control the quiet recognition that life was harder than it should have been. The Berlin Wall stood as the clearest expression of that contradiction. Built in 1961 to stop East Germans from leaving, it announced to the world what the regime would not admit, that many preferred to flee rather than live under its rule. For the state, the wall was protection. For its citizens, it was confinement. And to the watching world, it revealed the truth, and no slogan could hide that. Crises beyond Europe deepened these doubts. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Soviet missiles placed in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida, triggered a confrontation that lasted 13 days. And when the Soviet Union withdrew its weapons, the decision was presented as a diplomatic success. but few believed it. At home, the moment left a mark. Khrushchev had promised resolve and strength. His retreat suggested otherwise. A few years later, he was tested again. In 1968, Czechoslovakia tried to reform from within. Under Alexander Dubček, the government proposed socialism with a human face, a gentler, more open form of rule. Newspapers began to speak freely, and artists felt a return of possibility. For a while, the country seemed to breathe. And then from Moscow came the tanks. Soviet forces crossed the borders, crushed the reforms, and restored control. The lesson was unmistakable. The system could not and would not accept change from within. The pattern repeated itself abroad. In Vietnam, the Soviet Union offered weapons, money, and support to North Vietnam. The United States sent troops to defend the South. And when the Americans finally withdrew, it seemed like a victory for communism. Yet for Moscow, even this win brought little reward, only cost and exhaustion. The war had consumed resources that could have been used at home, where shortages and frustration were already growing. For many citizens, such distant struggles felt meaningless. They saw power projected outward, while their own lives stayed the same. The victories of ideology did not fill the shops or warm their houses. Then came Détente in the 1970s, a time of dialogue, hope and restraint. On the surface, East and West seemed to draw closer. Summits were held, treaties signed, and the language of confrontation began to soften. Yet the same openness that eased tension also revealed how deep the divide had become. Cultural exchanges, foreign films and glimpses of Western television showed a world of variety and comfort that few in the East could ever imagine. Western supermarkets overflowed with goods, their shelves bright and full. Western cars and music carried a new, youthful energy. Compared to that abundance, the drabness of Soviet life became impossible to ignore. Instead of reinforcing faith in the system through the possibility of coexistence, Détente chipped away at it. The more people saw of the outside world, the less convincing the old propaganda became. At the same time, the level of secrecy at home continued as if nothing was apparent to its people. When factories exploded or mines collapsed, officials hid the truth. When newspapers could not be trusted, news began to spread through whisper. People tuned in to Western broadcasts, leaning close to the static for a few stolen words of honesty. Listening in secret is an admittance that the truth lay elsewhere. The burden of competition with the United States only made matters worse. To match American advances, the Soviet Union poured vast resources into its military. Missiles, submarines, tanks and bombers. The spending maintained pride but deepened poverty. Industries that might have produced food or consumer goods were instead turned towards war. Mighty parades of military strength caused bitterness when the population lived the reality of declining means. The image of global strength concealed the weakness behind it. Quietly, people began to ask questions that no one dared voice aloud. Why could their leaders fund armies but not repair hospitals? Why did the country build so much yet deliver so little? They were small doubts, but together they marked a slow unraveling of belief. Through the Cold War's great confrontations, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Prague Spring, Vietnam and Détente itself had shown the limits of power. Each event revealed more clearly that control could not create conviction. By the late 1970s, obedience remained, but faith was gone. People complied because they must, not because they trusted. And when the fear finally began to fade in the decade that followed, this absence of belief would prove decisive. During the 1970s, oil became the backbone of the Soviet economy. Rising global prices brought in huge profits, and for a while it seemed like the system was secure. Oil money paid for food imports, housing and the military. Even as other industries weakened, the oil money could paper the cracks. Factories were outdated and farms produced less than planned, the country's success depending more and more on one resource. And when the oil prices dropped sharply in the early 1980s, the effect was immediate. The state could no longer afford the same level of support for its people. Imports slowed and the shops emptied, and the workers saw their wages lose value. The system had no easy way to adapt. It had grown so used to the easy money oil provided. The fall in oil prices and the knock-on effects began to strip away the illusion of stability and the economics of communism. Alongside this, the technological lag was another weakness that was becoming harder and harder to hide. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was struggling to keep up with new technology. Computers and electronics were changing life in the West, but Soviet factories were years behind. Most offices still used typewriters, and everyday goods from televisions to washing machines were old-fashioned and often unreliable. Strict planning slowed progress. Every new idea required approval, and success brought little reward. Many scientists and engineers worked on military projects because that was where the funding and recognition existed. Civilian technology suffered, and people could see the difference. Western products began to appear through visitors and black market trade, and drew immediate comparisons with the alternatives on offer at home. The country could still build rockets and tanks, but not the small machines that made life easier. And by the middle of the decade, the gap was so obvious. The Soviet system no longer seemed like the future. It looked stuck in the past. Then came a war that would prove catastrophic for a regime that had been nursing a disillusioned populace. In 1979, Soviet troops crossed into Afghanistan to support a faltering communist government. The plan was simple: secure the capital, install a more reliable leader, and withdraw once order was restored. History has shown time and time again that when interventions that seem simple on the surface become long and drawn out, questions become inevitable. And this was no different. The Soviets met fierce Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. They fought with determination born not only out of necessity, but ideology too. Although uncoordinated, sporadic groups of Afghan farmers knew the valleys, the mountain passes, and the rhythms of the land. Soviet soldiers, many barely 20 years old, found themselves in a country they did not understand, fighting an enemy they rarely saw. The official lines spoke of international duty and fraternal assistance, but the reality was much more different for the boots on the ground. Alongside this, their political rivals in the US had sensed an opportunity to foster instability. With Vietnam still relatively fresh in their minds, they knew the difficulties of eradicating guerrilla armies defending their very way of life. They would support the resistance in Afghanistan to give the Soviets a taste of their own Vietnam. Soviet air power initially gave confidence that a straightforward campaign was in store. Soviet air power gave initial confidence that a straightforward campaign was on offer. Helicopters and armored columns moved through the rugged terrain with ease, but when American-supplied Stinger missiles began to reach the rebels, this confidence vanished. The advantage the Soviets held in the air was neutralized, and soldiers were left isolated in unfamiliar terrain. As the war dragged on, the casualties mounted, and the aim and necessity of intervention became less and less clear. Letters home began to tell the truth that newspapers would not print. Stories of ambushes, friends killed by roadside mines, of commanders so afraid of reprisals They falsified reports to enhance the victories and minimize the losses. Unmarked coffins, some simply labeled cargo, came home to the mothers of these soldiers. To a grieving family, a death is not just another mark on the tally. It is a shattering of years of memories and parental love. Though discouraged from speaking out, many refused to keep quiet. The families of fallen soldiers began to meet and to ask questions that no one in authority wanted to hear. For Moscow, Afghanistan had been intended as a show of resolve, proof the Union still held influence beyond its borders. Instead, it became a display of exhaustion. The war drained money, equipment, and belief in the system. It revealed the limits of military power in a state that had shown to prioritize it over the livelihoods of its people. Afghanistan left the Soviet Union with questions of its own. It had weakened the army's prestige, deepened public disillusionment, and began to mark the end. During the war years, it became apparent that the lineup of Soviet politicians was increasingly aging. Brezhnev, who had ruled since the 60s, grew infirm and disengaged, his speeches slurred, his policies cautious. And after his death in 1982 came Andropov, a former KGB chief with sharp instincts but failing health. Then Chernenko, already gravely ill when he took power, lasted little more than a year. By 85, the leadership looked exhausted, trapped in a gerontocracy of old men presiding over a gradual decline. And when Mikhail Gorbachev arrived, people hoped for something different. At 54, he was young by Soviet standards, charismatic and unafraid to speak plainly about the crises his country faced. He recognized that the Soviet Union could not continue with regards to domestic or foreign policies. He launched reforms under two slogans, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost roughly translates to openness, and led a revolution in information. Newspapers began reporting honestly on corruption, on environmental disasters, even on Stalin's terror. For decades, Soviet citizens had whispered about the gulags, about the purges, and about the lies. Now, those truths appeared in print. People were stunned. They gathered around televisions to watch debates in the new Congress of People's Deputies. They read exposés that once would have meant prison for their authors. Although it felt new and exciting, when a government admits its past crimes and still contains a lot of the same names, it cannot easily demand present obedience purely because of a newfound honesty. Perestroika was a rethink of the general themes of Soviet economic policies. They aimed to inject life into a tired system. Factories were granted more autonomy, cooperatives allowed, and small businesses legalized. For the first time in decades, you could run a cafe or run a repair shop without breaking the law. But the reforms were inconsistent. Prices were still controlled, supply chains still centralized, and corruption still rampant. Instead of rejuvenating a system, Perestroika created chaos within it. A confused state, seemingly neither in or out of its own ideology. Abroad, Gorbachev sought to end confrontation. He met with Ronald Reagan, signed the INF Treaty to eliminate medium-range nuclear missiles, and in 1989 ordered the end of the Afghan campaign. Most dramatically, he declared that Moscow would no longer use force to keep Eastern Europe in line. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. Each nation could choose its own path. The consequences were immediate. Across Eastern Europe, protests swelled. In Poland, the solidarity movement, suppressed for years, started cries for free elections. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened, and East Germans streamed through it into the West. In East Germany itself, weekly demonstrations grew from a few hundred to hundreds of thousands. The regime tried to hold on, but by November 1989 it was over. When officials muddled through an announcement of new travel rules, crowds rushed to the checkpoints. Guards, unprepared and unwilling to shoot, opened the gates, and the Berlin Wall fell, piece by piece, as ordinary people took chisels and hammers to history. Elsewhere, the dominoes toppled. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution swept in new leadership. In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu tried to cling on with violence, but was executed by his own people. By the end of 1989, the communist governments of Eastern Europe had collapsed in a cascade. The Soviet Empire, built over 4 decades, dissolved almost overnight. At home, the consequences of glasnost and perestroika deepened. Nationalist movements surged in the republics. In the Baltics, human chains stretched across hundreds of kilometers as people demanded independence. In the Caucasus, long suppressed conflicts flared into violence. And in Ukraine, memories of famine and repression fueled calls for sovereignty. The Soviet Union, long presented as a family of nations, revealed itself as an empire of unwilling partners. Gorbachev tried to hold the center together with a new Union treaty, a looser federation of Soviet republics. But by 1991, his position was precarious. Conservatives in the party and the KGB saw him as reckless and beginning to dismantle socialism. Reformers saw him as too cautious, unwilling to go far enough. And then came the August coup. While Gorbachev holidayed in Crimea, hardliners declared that he was ill and announced a state of emergency. Tanks this time rolled into Moscow. The plotters tried to turn back the clock and to freeze history. But history refused. Crowds flooded the streets. Boris Yeltsin, the rising president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto a tank outside the parliament and declared defiance. Television broadcast his courage and the soldiers hesitated. For 3 tense days the world watched. And then the coup collapsed. The conspirators were arrested. Gorbachev returned, but his authority was in. Yeltsin was the man of the hour. In the months that followed, republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine held a referendum in which over 90% of people voted to leave. The Baltics were already gone. Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, one by one, they slipped away. In December 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus met secretly in a hunting lodge and signed the Belavezar Accords. The Soviet Union was dissolved. On Christmas Day of that year, Gorbachev resigned, and the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. For ordinary people, the collapse was both liberation and trauma. Freedoms arrived suddenly, freedom of speech, of travel, of enterprise. But along with this came chaos. The 1990s marked years of hardships. Prices soared as markets were liberalized overnight, savings evaporated, factories closed. A handful of men became oligarchs, seizing industry at bargain prices while millions slid into poverty. Life expectancy fell, crime rose, and many looked back on the stability of the old days with longing, even as they welcomed their new freedoms. Across the former republics, the story was similar. Some Baltic states turned westward, reforming rapidly and joining the European Union. Others descended into conflict. Borders had shifted, currencies collapsed, and nations struggled to redefine themselves. The world had changed, but not always in the way people had dreamed. The Cold War had ended without a great battle. No missiles were fired, no armies clashed. Instead, it had ended with disillusionment, with people who no longer believed in the promises of their state. It ended with mothers asking why their sons had died in Afghanistan, with workers wondering why the shelves were bare, with citizens who looked across the wall and saw a different life waiting. It ended because a system that had once inspired hope no longer inspired faith. The fall of the Berlin Wall had been the celebration, the visible explosion of joy. But the collapse of the Soviet Union itself was quieter, almost bureaucratic. Yet its impact was seismic. A superpower that had dominated global politics for 70 years was gone, and for the first time in modern history, the world was unipolar. And millions of people woke the next morning in new countries, their lives reshaped forever. The story of the Soviet collapse is the story of contradictions too deep to resolve, a system that promised equality but delivered shortages, that promised strength but suffered humiliation abroad. It promised progress but clung on to stagnant policies. It promised unity but ruled through fear. And when the fear was gone, the system had nothing left. And so it fell. The end of the Soviet Union left Russia with a framework of a state but without a clear idea of how to use it. The party had once directed every institution and was now gone, leaving ministries, courts and regional councils to operate on inertia. The habits of command persisted, but the center no longer held authority to match them. Boris Yeltsin entered this landscape as both reformer and survivor. He had built his reputation on defiance, standing against the old order in 1991, yet his new presidency began in uncertainty. Every decision felt provisional. Disputes over reform quickly turned into battles over power. Yeltsin's liberal advisors pushed for rapid transformation. The parliament resisted, fearing chaos and loss of control. The struggle deepened through the beginning of the decade until it became an open confrontation. In October, the standoff reached its climax, when Yeltsin ordered tanks to shell the White House where his opponents had barricaded themselves. The fighting lasted days, and when it ended, hundreds were dead. The old political system was gone, but so was much of the optimism that had followed independence. A new constitution was drafted within months. It granted sweeping authority to the presidency and reduced the lawmakers' power to challenge executive decisions. The arrangement brought order, but also imbalance. The Russian Federation had created the appearance of democratic institutions, but fundamentally, its foundations rested on emergency powers. Even as late as 1994, this system was still finding its shape. Parties emerged and faded quickly. Elections brought new faces, but influence flowed through networks rather than programs. Regional governors built their own power bases, often acting as intermediaries between Moscow and local elites. Corruption, once hidden under bureaucratic formality, became visible everywhere. Public trust was thin. Voters expected little from institutions that changed names but not behavior. It's great to have free press that debates freely, but what is the use when the government often rules by decree? Politics felt uncertain, improvised and reactive. It seemed to merely be managing instability, with no concrete means of a resolution. The collapse of the Soviet Union reshaped daily life more quickly than most people could absorb. Overnight, familiar routines lost meaning. Prices no longer stayed fixed. Jobs no longer guaranteed survival, and money no longer held steady value. People who had spent decades within a predictable, if limited, system found themselves navigating a world that demanded initiative in place of obedience. For many, the shift was disorientating. The stores that had once been empty now carried imported goods few could afford. People did whatever they could to make ends meet. The social contract that had defined the Soviet years, security in exchange for conformity, disappeared without warning. And the institutions that replaced it were still learning to function. Communities adapted in small, practical ways. Neighbors traded goods, shared heating fuel, or planted vegetables on small plots of land. Informal economies began to flourish. Survival depended on networks of trust rather than official systems. In many towns, the black market became the only market that worked. The loss of state control also changed the rhythm of public life. Crime increased, and corruption spread through police and administration alike. Television, newly free from censorship, filled the silence left by propaganda with debates and scandal. Freedom arrived before the nation could understand what it meant. Yet amid the confusion, there was also curiosity. Books long banned reappeared in print. Foreign films filled cinemas. Musicians, journalists, and artists explored subjects that had been untouchable for generations. Meanwhile, memory complicated everything. The past was close enough to remember, but too recent to judge. Some saw the Soviet period as an era of stability unfairly lost. Others as a weight finally lifted. The divide ran through families and friendships. In conversation, people compared the price of bread to the value of freedom. And no one agreed which one mattered more. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited its seat on the United Nations Security Council, its nuclear arsenal, and a sense of responsibility that no longer matched its power. The empire had vanished, but the expectations of global influence remained. The new government faced a world in which alliances, borders, and priorities had already shifted without it. In the first years after 1991, foreign policy was uncertain. Moscow's overriding goal was stability, to prevent further fragmentation at home and chaos along its borders. Yet every decision carried echoes of loss. The Baltic states had regained independence. Ukraine and Kazakhstan controlled their own nuclear weapons. Eastern Europe, once bound to Moscow by the Warsaw Pact, turned decisively toward the West. The strategic map the Soviet planners had lived by no longer existed. Boris Yeltsin and his foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, sought to redefine Russia's role through cooperation rather than confrontation. They spoke of partnership with the United States and participation in European institutions. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the old Cold War divide might give way to a shared order. Moscow signed arms reduction agreements, accepted the reunification of Germany, and supported peacekeeping efforts under United Nations command. Yet beneath these gestures ran a quiet tension. Many in the Russian parliament viewed alignment with the West as surrender. They saw NATO's continued presence and its talk of eventual expansion as humiliation disguised as diplomacy. The memory of superpower parity was still fresh, and the reality of dependence on Western aid was difficult to accept. The war in Yugoslavia deepened these doubts. Russia had cultural and historical ties to Serbia, and the NATO-led intervention there was seen by many in Moscow as a warning that Western powers would act without consultation. At home, nationalist voices gained influence by arguing that Russia had traded strength for approval. By 1994, the tone of diplomacy had changed. The government still spoke of partnership, but it began to emphasize sovereignty and independence more firmly. Western loans were welcome, yet the conditions attached to them, especially economic reform and oversight, fed resentment. Cooperation continued, but the balance of respect that once defined great power relations had not been restored. In these early years, Russian foreign policy reflected a deeper question about identity. Was the new Russia a European state, integrating into the global order, or the heir to a distinct civilization with its own sphere of influence? The answer shifted with each crisis. Without the ideological certainty of the Soviet era, policy once again became reactive, a search for standing in a world that seemed to move on without it. By the mid-1990s, the optimism of early cooperation had faded. Russia remained a major military power, but lacked the economic and political strength to shape events. The memory of global influence lingered, yet the reality was one of adjustment. The Cold War had ended, but the search for relevance had only begun. Energy was one of the few assets Russia carried intact from the Soviet past. Oil fields in western Siberia and gas pipelines across Eastern Europe remained operational even as ministries, armies and alliances collapsed. In the early 1990s, this infrastructure became the foundation of the new state's economy, a source of hard currency when almost everything else had lost value. Revenues from energy exports funded the government through its most unstable times. Taxes were unreliable, industries bankrupt, and inflation out of control. But oil and gas were still in demand across the world. The trade kept the budget alive and paid for imports that domestic production could no longer supply. In many ways, it was energy, not policy, that held the country together. Control over these resources, however, quickly became contested. In the absence of effective regulation, the energy sector turned into a battleground for influence. Former party officials, regional managers and emerging financiers competed to take over export routes, drilling rights in refineries. What had been state property became private wealth through hurried privatizations and opaque deals. The result was a new class of businessmen whose fortunes depended on commodities rather than innovation. Oil and gas, once symbols of national power, became instruments of personal enrichment. Some of the wealth flowed back into politics, financing campaigns and shaping policy in parliament. The boundary between economic and political power blurred almost completely. Beyond Russia's borders, energy carried diplomatic weight. Many former Soviet republics and Eastern European countries still relied on Russian gas for heating and electricity. Contracts and supply arrangements became tools of persuasion. When disputes arose over prices, debts, or transit routes, Moscow could use energy flows to remind its neighbors of old dependencies. These gestures were usually quiet, but they revealed how much of the Soviet network still functioned beneath the surface. By the middle of the decade, energy exports accounted for the majority of Russia's foreign income. Oil and gas could not solve the deeper structural problems of the economy, but they allowed the state to postpone hard decisions. This reliance on resources would shape the pattern of post-Soviet development for years to come. Energy provided survival. In time, it would become the main lever through which Russia tried to regain influence, the most durable legacy of its Soviet inheritance. The collapse of the Soviet Union created 15 new states, but it did not dissolve the complex web of peoples who had lived together within it. Borders drawn on paper could not separate identities that had developed over centuries of coexistence and migration. Across the former empire, communities found themselves divided by new frontiers, and questions that had been buried under ideology returned with force. In Russia itself, the problem of identity was immediate and unresolved. The country had always defined itself as the core of a larger union, not as a nation among others. Independence meant freedom, but also isolation. For the first time in modern history, Russia had to imagine itself without the framework of empire, a task that proved emotionally and politically difficult. National movements that had driven the disintegration of the USSR continued to shape the region after 1991. In the Baltic states, independence brought rapid reorientation towards Europe. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, the transition was more fragile. Ethnic boundaries, long managed through Soviet administration, now became flashpoints for violence. In Georgia, civil war erupted between supporters of the government and separatist fortists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Armenia and Azerbaijan fought over Nagorno-Karabakh, a conflict rooted in decades of unresolved grievance. The war left tens of thousands dead and displaced many more, setting a pattern of instability that would haunt the region for decades. In the North Caucasus, the Republic of Chechnya declared independence in 1991. For Moscow, the secession was intolerable, not only for strategic reasons, but for what it symbolized. The state had just lost half its empire. It could not risk losing part of its own territory. Tensions escalated as negotiations failed, and the region slipped beyond federal control. The First Chechen War began at the end of 1994. Russian forces entered Grozny expecting a short campaign. Instead, they met fierce resistance. The fighting devastated the city and killed thousands of civilians. For Russians watching on television, it was a shocking return to violence inside their own borders. The war revealed how fragile the new federation remained, and how quickly the old reflex of coercion returned when authority was challenged. Beyond the battlefields, the collapse of Soviet identity reshaped everyday thinking. People no longer described themselves as Soviet citizens, but the meaning of being Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian or Kazakh was still in flux. In some regions, nationalism offered pride. In others, it bred resentment. Populations that had once mixed freely now found themselves separated by visas and borders, families again divided, and minorities in the new republics often became scapegoats for frustration. Memory intensified these divisions. The Soviet Union had presented itself as a family of nations. For many, the loss of unity felt like personal dislocation. The myths of brotherhood and progress gave way to more local loyalties, ethnic, religious, and regional, each competing for recognition and security. By the mid-1990s, the post-Soviet space had settled into uneasy fragmentation. Numerous wars and the political turmoil in Central Asia made clear that the empire's end was not a single event, but an ongoing process. The Soviet project had tried to fuse identities under one vision of the future. What followed its collapse was a struggle to remember what people had been before that vision began. The first years after Soviet collapse were a time of improvisation more than transformation. Institutions survived, but their meanings changed. Power no longer answered to ideology, and wealth no longer depended on plan or quota. Russia remained vast, resource-rich and militarily powerful, yet its direction was uncertain. The empire had ended, but the habits of an imperial state endured. Each sphere of life reflected this mixture of collapse and persistence. The economy moved from command to market, but production still relied on the same industries that had anchored the Soviet system. Politics adopted the language of democracy, yet authority continued to flow from the top down. Society was newly open, but still shaped by collective endurance. Even foreign policy, stripped of ideological mission, carried the reflexes of a great power adjusting to smaller horizons. The energy sector, the most stable inheritance from the Soviet past, became both a lifeline and a warning. Oil and gas kept the state solvent, but they also encouraged dependence on a single source of strength, a pattern that echoed earlier decades in quieter form. In the Caucasus and along the empire's old borders, the violence of fragmentation showed how deeply history still governed the present. It was a state defined by contradiction, modernizing and decaying at once, liberalizing yet fearful of disorder, claiming to begin anew while living within the shadow of what had ended. The Soviet Union had vanished, yet its imprint remained everywhere, in the structure of government, in the geography of power, and in the memory of its people. The Cold War was over, but the legacies of its longest participant would take a generation to fade, and some perhaps never would. Thank you for listening to Sleep with History. I hope by now you're resting easily, somewhere between thought and dream. If you're still awake, there are more stories waiting, journeys through other moments that shaped our world. You can find them here on Sleep with History. Until next time, sleep well and good night.